I wasn't supposed to notice it, but I did. Right before I walked into the bank, I saw my son standing near the manager's desk, leaning in, whispering something. And the moment he saw me, he stopped. Not like someone caught off guard, but like someone who didn't want me to hear what was just said. I pretended everything was normal. I walked in, slowly, like I hadn't seen a thing. But then the manager looked at me, and that look wasn't normal. It wasn't confusion, it wasn't surprise. It was hesitation, like he knew something I wasn't supposed to know. And when he finally told me everything I thought I knew about my own life, about my own son, started to fall apart. Before we delve into all the details of this story, we need to go back a little to explain how we arrived at this crucial moment in my life. I sincerely ask you to subscribe to help us continue bringing you these incredible stories that have changed lives. My name is Walter Hess, and if you had asked anyone in Millhaven, Oregon, who the least likely person to be sitting alone in a bank manager's office discovering that his own son had been systematically dismantling his life behind his back was, most people would have pointed at me without hesitation. Not because I was naive, but because I was the kind of man who had spent 43 years making sure that the people around him never had a reason to. I was the one who showed up. I was the one who fixed things before they broke, who paid things before they were due, who stayed long after everyone else had gone home because the work was not finished, and unfinished work was something I had never learned to sleep next to comfortably. I grew up in a small fishing town on the Oregon coast called Baycroft, the second of 4 children raised by a father who repaired boat engines for a living and a mother who worked the early shift at a cannery and still managed to have dinner on the table by 6 every evening without ever making it seem like a sacrifice. We did not have much, but we had the specific dignity that comes from earning everything you possess, from knowing that nothing in your house arrived without someone in your family working for it, and that understanding became the architecture of everything I built later in life. My father used to say that a man who cannot account for where his money went is a man who cannot account for where his time went, and that a man who cannot account for his time has not really been living, he has just been passing through. I wrote that down when I was 16, and I have never forgotten it. I started Hess Fabrication and Supply out of a converted warehouse space in Millhaven when I was 31, with a business partner named Roy Alderman, who handled the sales side while I handled operations, and a small business loan that I lay awake thinking about for the first 6 months, until the contracts started coming in steadily enough that the anxiety became something more manageable, something closer to productive alertness. Roy left the business amicably after 7 years to pursue something else, and I bought out his share at a fair price and kept going alone, which suited my temperament better than I had expected. My wife Miriam was the one who understood the business almost as well as I did, not because she worked in it directly, but because she had the rare ability to see systems and patterns and pressure points that people who were too close to something often missed. She would sit across from me at the kitchen table on Sunday evenings while I reviewed the week, and she would ask 2 or 3 questions that invariably identified exactly the thing I had been circling around without landing on. And then she would close the folder and say, "You will figure it out, Walter. You always do. And go make tea." And I always did figure it out, partly because I'm stubborn, and partly because her confidence in me made failure feel like an imposition I was unwilling to place on someone who deserved better. Our son Declan was born in the 3rd year of the business, when Miriam and I were still eating dinner at the folding table we used as a temporary solution for 18 months, because there was no room in the budget for a real dining set, and we had mutually agreed that it was not the kind of thing worth going into debt for. Declan grew up in a house that was comfortable but careful, where the heat was turned down at night and the car was kept until it genuinely could not be repaired anymore, and vacations were camping trips to the coast because the coast was beautiful and free and we had everything we needed. I did not think of this as deprivation, and neither did Miriam, and for most of Declan's childhood, neither did he, or at least he never said so, and I believed that silence on the subject meant contentment rather than what it apparently actually meant, which I would not understand until much later. Declan was a gifted student in the specific way that makes teachers enthusiastic and parents quietly hopeful, the kind of intelligence that is broad rather than deep, that picks up the surface of most subjects quickly and confidently and gives the impression of mastery that sometimes substitutes for it. He went to Oregon State on a partial scholarship and studied finance, and when he came back to Millhaven after graduation, he was wearing a different kind of confidence than the one he had left with, something that had been sharpened by 4 years of being told that the future belonged to people who understood how to move capital rather than how to make things. I noticed the change, but I interpreted it as growth rather than replacement. The way parents often misread the signs that are right in front of them because love has a particular kind of blindness built into it that is both its greatest strength and its most dangerous vulnerability. He joined Hess Fabrication and Supply 2 years after graduation, after a stint at a financial services firm in Portland that ended when the firm restructured and eliminated his department. I offered him the position not out of obligation, but because he was genuinely capable, and because I believed, with the sincerity that only a parent in that situation can fully understand, that working inside the thing I had built would connect him to the values that had built it, the way spending time in a garden teaches you to respect what grows slowly. I made him Director of Business Development, gave him responsibility for new client relationships and contract negotiations, and watched him perform the role with a smoothness that impressed me and, I now understand, impressed me too much, because I was watching the performance and not looking carefully enough at what was happening behind it. Here is what I need you to understand before I go any further, because this is the part of the story that most people get wrong when they hear it. The warning signs were there. They were not hidden. They were in plain sight, dressed in explanations that were just plausible enough that I chose to accept them rather than interrogate them, because interrogating them would have required me to consider a possibility that I was not ready to consider. That is not stupidity. That is the specific vulnerability of loving someone for decades, of having their face be one of the first faces you ever truly knew, of carrying in your body the memory of holding them when they were small enough to hold. It creates a blind spot that is not weakness, but is simply the cost of having loved someone completely. The first sign came 14 months before the morning at the bank. Declan came to me with a proposal for a new contract structure with one of our largest clients, a regional construction group called Paladin Development, suggesting we shift from our standard billing arrangement to a retainer model that he said would provide more predictable revenue. The proposal was professionally prepared and the logic was sound on the surface, but something about the fee structure felt slightly off to me. A small rounding in the numbers that did not match the pattern of our usual arrangements. I asked him to walk me through the calculation, and he did, fluently and without hesitation, and I told myself that the fluency was proof of legitimacy, and approved the change. What I did not know then was that the adjustment created a small but consistent margin between what Paladin was paying and what was being recorded in our main accounts. And that margin was going somewhere that was not the company. The second sign came 8 months later, at a family dinner that should have been a pleasant evening, and instead became the moment I now recognize as the one where I should have stopped and asked a very different set of questions. Declan had brought his girlfriend Renata, a woman in her mid-30s who was pleasant enough in the polished way of someone who has learned to make good impressions without revealing much. And over dinner, the conversation turned to property, as conversations in Oregon often do, and Renata mentioned casually that she and Declan had been looking at a house in the Cascade foothills, a property in a price range that stopped me mid-sentence because it was significantly beyond what Declan's salary at the company could support without a financial cushion I had no knowledge of. I looked at him and he met my eyes and said, "I have been saving, Dad, and investing, you know how I am." And I nodded, and the dinner continued, and Renata talked about the kitchen and the view, and I smiled and passed the bread, and I filed the number away in a part of my mind where things go when you are not ready to open them. The third sign, the one that should have broken through entirely but did not, came 4 months before the bank, when Miriam was in the hospital for what turned out to be a manageable cardiac event, but which at the time felt enormous and terrifying in the specific way that health scares feel when the person involved is the one your entire interior life is organized around. I was at the hospital every day, and Declan came twice, which was fewer times than I expected, but which I attributed to the demands of running the business in my absence rather than to indifference, because attributing it to indifference was something I was not equipped to do while sitting in a hospital corridor waiting for news about my wife. What I learned much later was that during those 2 weeks while I was at the hospital and my attention was entirely elsewhere, Declan had initiated contact with a business acquisitions consultant in Seattle, a man named Garrett Pollard, who specialized in brokering the sale of mid-size regional manufacturing and supply companies. Declan had described himself in those communications as the principal decision-maker of Hess Fabrication and Supply, and had provided Pollard with internal financial documents that were not his to share, laying the groundwork for a transaction that I knew nothing about and had never agreed to. Now, I need to tell you about the morning at the bank, but to tell it properly, I need to tell you something that happened the evening before, something small that I almost did not register at the time, but that I have thought about many times since, because it was the moment the story could have gone differently if I had been paying a different kind of attention. Declan came by the house that evening, which was not unusual. He stopped by 2 or 3 times a week, and we sat on the back porch with coffee the way we often did, and talked about the week. He was relaxed, or performing relaxed, and at one point he said, "Dad, have you ever thought about what you would do if you weren't running the company anymore?" And I said something about fishing and traveling the coast, and he laughed and said, "Seriously, though?" And I said, "Seriously, I would probably still find something to build, because that is the only thing I have ever really known how to do." He looked at me for a moment, and then he looked out at the yard, and he said, "You have built enough, Dad. You should let someone else carry it for a while." And I heard it as a son expressing concern for an aging father. And I thanked him for it and changed the subject. And he left an hour later, and I went inside and told Miriam the coffee had been good and went to bed. The next morning I drove to Cascade Valley Bank on Millhaven's main commercial strip, a branch I had been using for the business and personal accounts for 16 years, managed by a woman named Caroline Marsh, who had the precise, careful manner of someone who took the responsibility of other people's financial security genuinely seriously. My appointment was for 10 o'clock. I arrived at 9:55 because I have always been constitutionally incapable of being late to anything. And as I pulled into the parking lot and got out of the truck, I looked through the large front window of the bank and I saw them. Declan and Caroline, standing near the door of her private office, close together, his head angled toward her in the posture of someone communicating something they do not want overheard, and her face carrying the particular expression of a person who is being asked to do something they are uncertain about. The moment Declan looked up and saw me through the glass, his expression changed. It did not collapse or panic, it simply rearranged, the way a careful person manages their face when they need to, and he raised a hand and smiled and said something to Caroline and walked toward the exit. We met at the door, and he said he had come early to drop off some quarterly paperwork, nothing important, just being efficient, and I said of course, and he left, and I walked in. And Caroline looked at me with that hesitation I described to you at the beginning of this story, that particular expression of a person standing at the intersection of professional duty and human conscience, trying to calculate which road to take. She took the right road, That is the thing I'm most grateful for in this entire story, that Caroline Marsh, a woman I had known professionally for 16 years, chose the harder and more honest path when a simpler one was available to her. She sat me down in her office, and she closed the door, and she said, "Walter, I need to ask you something directly before we proceed with today's meeting," and I told her to go ahead. She said that Declan had visited the bank 4 times in the past 2 months, and that on his most recent visit, that morning, he had presented a legal document granting him broad financial authority over my personal and business accounts, including the ability to authorize transfers, restructure holdings, and enter into agreements on my behalf. She said the document was formally prepared and appeared legitimate on its surface. She said he had asked her to process it that morning before my appointment so that it would already be active when I arrived. And then she looked at me steadily and she said, "I have known you for a long time, and I have never known you to hand over control of anything without understanding exactly what you are handing over. So before I do anything with this document, I need to hear from you directly whether you authorized it." I asked her to show it to me. She placed it on the desk. I read it carefully, the way I read every document I have ever signed in 43 years of running a business, which is to say slowly and completely, because I had learned early that the things that destroy you are always in the parts people assume you will not bother to read. The signature at the bottom of the final page was mine, in the way that a very good copy is mine, close enough to fool someone who had only seen my signature a handful of times, but not close enough to fool me, because I knew the specific way I formed the letters of my own name, the slight leftward lean of the capital H, the way the double S at the end of Hess closed into a loop that was tighter than most people would replicate, because I had developed it unconsciously over decades. The signature on that document was made by someone who had studied my handwriting carefully and had come very close, but close is not the same as right, and I knew the difference the moment I saw it. I set the document down and I looked at Caroline, and I said, "My son forged this." She exhaled slowly, the breath of someone releasing something they had been holding for several weeks. She told me she had suspected something was wrong from the second visit, that the quality of Declan's urgency had felt transactional in a way that did not match the language of a son managing a parent's affairs out of genuine care, but rather the language of someone managing a timeline. She said she had delayed and asked for additional documentation and had made the decision that morning, when he pushed to have everything processed before I arrived, that she would do nothing until she had spoken with me directly. What she told me next was the thing that changed the temperature of the room. She said that on his 3rd visit, 2 weeks earlier, Declan had not come alone. He had brought a man she did not recognize, who had sat in the waiting area while Declan met with her, and that after the meeting Declan had introduced him briefly as a business associate, a consultant from Seattle who was helping him with some corporate restructuring. She had not thought much of it at the time. She was thinking much more of it now. I asked her to make copies of everything, the document, the visit records, every interaction log her system had generated for my accounts over the previous 3 months. She did it immediately and without hesitation. I also asked her to add a verification requirement to all my accounts, a personal code word that only I would know and that would be required for any transaction or structural change regardless of who requested it. She set it up while I sat there. The word I chose was Baycroft, the name of the town where my father smelled like iron and lake water, and my mother stretched every dollar until it became almost 2. Some things you keep because they hold the weight of what you came from. I drove home with the copies on the passenger seat, and I sat in the driveway for a few minutes before going inside, looking at the front of the house that Miriam and I had bought 27 years ago, when the business had finally grown enough to make it possible. The house with the Stella's jays that came to the feeder every morning, and the garden that Miriam kept with the same patient precision she brought to everything she loved. I thought about telling her immediately and decided against it, not to protect Declan but to protect her, because her heart was still recovering, and the shock of this specific truth was the kind that needed to be delivered carefully and at the right moment. And this was not yet the right moment because I did not yet have the full picture. I called a woman named Sylvia Okafor that afternoon, a forensic accountant based in Portland who came recommended by my attorney as someone with particular expertise in financial irregularities within family-owned businesses. I told her enough to get her started and sent her the scanned copies of everything Caroline had given me, and she told me she would begin immediately and have a preliminary assessment within a week. Then I called my attorney, a man named Bernard Cho, who had handled every significant legal matter for Hess Fabrication and Supply for 19 years, and who had the specific quality I had always valued most in a professional, which was that he told you exactly what you needed to hear rather than what you wanted to hear, and he did it without drama or unnecessary alarm, in the steady voice of someone who has navigated difficult situations enough times to know that clarity is the only thing that actually helps. Bernard told me that the forged power of attorney was a serious matter, and that we needed to document everything carefully before making any moves, because moving too early would give Declan the opportunity to complicate the situation in ways that would make resolution harder. He also said that the mention of the Seattle consultant was significant, and that we needed to identify who that person was before we understood the full scope of what was happening. He said, "Walter, I need you to do something that is going to be very difficult, and that is to continue behaving normally for the next 2 to 3 weeks while we build a complete picture, because incomplete information acted on too quickly is more dangerous than patience." I told him I understood. I had spent 43 years knowing when to wait and when to move. This was a moment for waiting. The 2.5 weeks that followed were the strangest of my life, stranger even than the weeks around Miriam's hospital stay, because then the strangeness was imposed from outside and was entirely honest, while this strangeness was something I was actively maintaining through deliberate performance. I had lunch with Declan on the Tuesday of the first week, at the same diner on Cascade Street we had been going to for years, and I listened to him talk about a new client prospect in the valley and asked questions and passed the sugar and laughed at something he said about the drive up from Portland, and the whole time I was sitting across from my son with the knowledge of what he had done pressed flat inside my chest like a document folded too many times. I'd never been a particularly theatrical person, but I learned something about myself in those weeks, which was that the discipline required to be patient when you want to act is exactly the same discipline as the one required to run a business through difficult years. And I had been practicing that discipline for 4 decades without knowing it was also preparation for this. Sylvia called me at the end of the first week with her preliminary findings, and I want to be honest with you about what I felt when I heard them, because this is not a simple story, and I do not want to tell it simply. What she found was not a small, opportunistic theft. It was a structured, patient, methodical redirection of funds from the company's accounts into 2 separate entities that Declan had established over the previous 26 months. A limited liability company registered in Nevada, and a secondary account held under a business name that bore no obvious connection to him. The total she had identified so far was $240,000, with indications that the actual figure was likely higher. She had also confirmed the identity of the Seattle consultant, a man named Garrett Pollard, and had obtained records showing that Pollard had been engaged by Declan to broker the sale of Hess Fabrication and Supply to a private investment group on the East Coast, a group that specialized in acquiring and then dismantling regional manufacturing companies, stripping their assets, liquidating their contracts, and selling the pieces separately at a profit that bore no relationship to what those companies had meant to the communities they operated in or the people who had built them. The plan, as Bernard and Sylvia reconstructed it together, was this. The power of attorney once processed would have given Declan the legal authority to complete the sale without my signature on the final documents. The transaction was structured to close within 60 days of the POA being activated. Declan would have received a finder's fee from Pollard's firm in addition to a negotiated share of the sale proceeds, framed in the paperwork as a management buyout arrangement that would have been very difficult to challenge after the fact. I would have been presented with a completed sale, a check for a fraction of what the company was worth, and a legal structure designed to limit my options for recourse. By the time I understood what had happened, the company would have been in the process of being taken apart. The 43 years of relationships and reputation and careful building reduced to line items in an acquisition report. I sat with that information for a full day before I was ready to speak to anyone about it. I sat with it the way you sit with a structural diagnosis that confirms the thing you were afraid it would confirm, not with surprise, but with the particular grief of certainty, of the moment when what you suspected becomes what you know, and there is no longer any shelter in uncertainty. I sat with it, and I thought about my father and the boat engines and the smell of iron and lake water, and I thought about Miriam and the yellow legal pad and the Sunday evenings at the kitchen table, and I thought about Declan at 3 years old learning to walk on the worn kitchen linoleum of the house before this one, falling and getting up with the cheerful persistence of someone who has not yet learned that falling is supposed to be discouraging. I thought about all of that, and then I let myself feel the full weight of it for exactly one evening, and then I called Bernard and told him it was time to move. Bernard had spent the 2 weeks preparing with the thoroughness that I had always relied on him for. He had coordinated with Sylvia to freeze the Nevada LLC through the appropriate legal channels and had filed a formal challenge to the power of attorney document with the state, supported by the forensic handwriting analysis he had commissioned from a document examiner in Eugene, who had provided a 17-page report concluding with professional certainty that the signature was not mine. He had also prepared a cease and desist communication for Garrett Pollard in Seattle, notifying him that any representations made to his client group regarding the availability of Hess fabrication and supply for acquisition were fraudulent, and that any transaction initiated on that basis would be challenged in full. And he had prepared the documentation for a civil action against Declan that covered the forged document, the unauthorized transfers, and the breach of fiduciary duty. A package that Bernard described as comprehensive enough to result in outcomes that Declan would find very difficult to manage without significant cooperation. The meeting was set for a Thursday morning at Bernard's office. I told Declan it was a routine estate planning review that Bernard wanted both of us present for, because there were some beneficiary designations that needed updating, and Bernard preferred to have family present for that kind of discussion. Declan agreed without any visible hesitation, which told me either that he was genuinely confident the power of attorney had already been processed, and that his position was secure, or that he was a better performer than I had given him credit for. He arrived in the good jacket he wore to meetings he considered significant, and he sat down across from Bernard's desk with the ease of someone who does not yet know they are sitting in the wrong chair. Bernard did not preamble. He was not a man who believed in softening the approach when directness was more honest and ultimately more humane. And he placed the forensic accounting report on the desk and the document examiner's analysis beside it and the copy of the forged power of attorney on top of both, and he began to speak in the measured, precise voice of someone delivering a professional assessment of a structural failure, which is exactly what it was. I sat to the side and I watched my son's face. The controlled stillness came first, the same rearrangement I had seen through the bank window, and then something underneath it began to shift as Bernard continued speaking, and the scope of what was documented became clear. Declan tried the explanation first, saying that the transfers were informal loans he had intended to repay, that the POA was precautionary and not intended to be used without my knowledge, that Pollard was just an exploratory conversation that had never been meant to go anywhere without my involvement. Each explanation was met by Bernard with the specific document that contradicted it, quietly and without triumph, in the way of a man who has simply done the work and is now presenting the results. The explanations ran out in the order they had been constructed, and what was left when they were gone was just the room and the documents and the two of us. Then Bernard said something that changed the direction of everything, something I had not anticipated, something that I think about now as the true pivot of the story, the moment that shifted it from a straightforward account of betrayal and consequence into something more complicated and ultimately more true. He said, "Declan, I want to show you one more document." And he placed on the desk a single sheet of paper that was not part of the legal package, not part of the forensic report, not part of any official proceeding. It was a letter. He said, "Your father wrote this 3 days ago and asked me to include it at this point in our meeting." Declan looked at the letter and then looked at me, and I nodded, and he picked it up, and he read it, and the room was completely silent while he did. I'm going to tell you what the letter said because I think it is the most important part of this story and the part that most changes what the story is actually about. The letter said this: "Declan, I know what you did and I know why you did it. And the why matters to me more than most people would expect it to. I have spent the past 3 weeks trying to understand not just the action, but the conditions that made it feel possible to you, and what I have come to believe is that, somewhere along the way, I failed to show you that what I built was built for you and your mother and not for itself, and that in failing to show you that clearly enough, I created a silence that you filled with a wrong conclusion, the conclusion that the only way to access what was yours was to take it. That is on me as much as it is on you, and I am not willing to pretend otherwise. What you did was wrong and the consequences are real, and I am not going to protect you from them, but I am also not going to let this be the whole story of who you are or who we are to each other, because I have known you since before you could walk, and I know that the person who did this is not the only person you are capable of being. I am asking you to choose differently from here, not for me, for yourself." Declan did not speak for a long time after he finished reading. When he did, his voice was different from any version I had heard that morning, stripped of the smoothness and the management, something underneath it that was unguarded in the way of a person who has run out of the energy required to keep a particular performance going. He said, "I thought you were going to sell it eventually, and I would get nothing, and all those years would count for nothing. And I know that is not an excuse. And I know I should have said it to you directly, and I didn't, because I was afraid of what you would say, and I am sorry. And I understand that sorry doesn't fix what I did, and I am sorry for that too. It was not an eloquent speech. It was not designed. It was just a person in a room with the truth, and not enough left to dress it in anything else. What happened after that was this." Declan agreed to every condition Bernard presented. The full restitution of the transferred funds through a structured repayment arrangement that Sylvia designed to be realistic but non-negotiable. The formal withdrawal of any representations made to Garrett Pollard's firm, and his resignation from Hess Fabrication and Supply with a signed acknowledgement of the terms of his departure. He did not negotiate any of it. He signed where Bernard told him to sign, and when it was done, he looked at me and I looked at him, and neither of us said anything for a moment that was long enough to contain everything that needed to be in it. I told him before he left that the door was not closed, that I was not handing down a verdict on the rest of his life, that what he did with what came next was his to determine, and I would be watching to see who he chose to be. He nodded, and he left. And Bernard and I sat in the quiet of the office, and Bernard poured 2 glasses of water from the pitcher on his desk, and we drank them without speaking. The way 2 people who have just been through something difficult sometimes need to simply occupy the same space for a moment before returning to the world. Here is what I have not told you yet, and this is the part that I promised you would come. The thing that shifted the story one more time, when I thought I already understood its shape. 6 weeks after that meeting, I received a phone call from Caroline Marsh at Cascade Valley Bank. She said she needed to see me in person, that there was something she had discovered in reviewing the account activity from the previous months, that she believed I needed to know and that she did not want to communicate over the phone. I went in that afternoon, and she sat me down in her office, and she placed a transaction record on the desk, and she said, "Walter, I almost didn't show you this because I wasn't sure it was my place, but I think you would want to know." The record showed a transfer I had not seen in Sylvia's forensic report because it had been made from an account that Sylvia had not yet reviewed, a small personal savings account that I had maintained separately from the business accounts for years, one of those accounts that exists at the edge of your financial life and that you rarely think about because it is not connected to anything operational. The transfer was for $38,000, made 11 months earlier, to an account in Miriam's name at a different institution. Caroline said she had traced it as far as she could, and what she found was that the money had been used to pay for a specific medical procedure, one that Miriam had needed and that our insurance had declined to cover, and that I had not known about because Miriam had not told me. And the reason Miriam had not told me was that she had gone to Declan first, and Declan had found the money and paid for it without telling me. And the reason the money had come from my account rather than his was that his accounts were already stretched from the early stages of everything else he had been doing, and so he had taken it from mine, but he had taken it for her. I sat in Caroline's office with that information, and I did not know what to feel, which is not a state I am accustomed to, and I think the honest answer is that I felt everything at once, in a proportion that was impossible to sort out quickly, which is probably why I simply sat there for a while without speaking. Declan had stolen from me to pay for his mother's medical care. The same hands that had forged my signature on a document designed to take everything I had built had also, 11 months earlier, reached into my accounts to make sure the woman I loved most in the world did not have to go without a procedure she needed. The same person. Both things true simultaneously. That is not a simple story, and I am not going to pretend it is. I went home, and I told Miriam everything that evening, all of it, from the bank window to Bernard's office to Caroline's phone call, and she listened the way she always listened, completely and without interrupting. And when I finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "I knew about the medical payment, Walter. I knew he did it, and I knew where it came from, and I should have told you, and I didn't, because I didn't want you to be in the position you are in right now, which is trying to hold 2 true things about your son at the same time. And I know how hard that is for you, because you have always needed things to be structurally sound before you can work with them, and this is not structurally sound. This is just human, and human is harder." I looked at her, and I thought about 38 years of Sunday evenings at the kitchen table, and I thought about the Stella's jays at the feeder, and I thought about my father and his boats, and I thought that she was, as she had always been, exactly right. I called Declan the next day. He answered on the second ring, cautious in the way of someone who has been waiting for a call they are not sure they want to receive. I told him I knew about the medical payment. There was a long silence on the line, and then he said, "I should have found a better way," and I said, "Yes, you should have, and I mean that about all of it." And he said, "I know," and I said, "I also know why you did the part of it you did it for, and that does not change the accounting, but it changes something, and I need you to know that I know." Another silence. longer this time, and then something in his breathing shifted in a way that told me without any words that this was the thing he had not known whether he was going to be allowed to have. The acknowledgement that he was not entirely one thing, that the full ledger of who he was had more than one kind of entry in it. We are not back to where we were. I do not know if we will be, or if where we were was ever entirely what I thought it was, and that uncertainty is something I am learning to live with rather than resolve, because some structures are not meant to be rebuilt exactly as they were. Sometimes the damage reveals a design flaw that needed to be corrected, and the new version, though different, is more honest about what it actually is and what it can actually hold. Declan is making the restitution payments on the schedule Sylvia established. He has not returned to the company, and I do not expect him to, at least not for a long time and not in the same role, because trust is not a switch that you flip. It is a structure that you build one verified day at a time, and we are at the very beginning of that process with no guarantees about where it ends. Hess Fabrication and Supply is still mine. The 43 years are still intact. The clients are still there, the reputation is still there. The people who have worked for me for decades are still showing up every morning in the trucks with the company name on the side, doing the work the way I taught them to do it, which is carefully and completely and without cutting the corners that always cost you more than you saved. I hired a new director of operations, a man named Frank Ito, who had been my floor manager for 14 years and who approached the business with the specific combination of technical knowledge and personal integrity that I had been looking for without knowing exactly what I was looking for until I saw it already present in someone I had been working alongside for over a decade. Frank does not know the full story of why the previous arrangement changed, and I have not told him. Not because I am ashamed, but because the story belongs to me and to Declan and to Miriam and to the particular shape of our family, and it does not need to belong to everyone. What I want to leave you with is not a simple lesson, because this was not a simple situation, and I would be doing you a disservice to reduce it to one. What I want to leave you with is this. The morning I stood on the sidewalk outside Cascade Valley Bank in the cold, with my coat half buttoned and my keys in my hand, and watched my son lower his voice when he saw me through the glass, I felt the specific fear of a person who is about to discover something that cannot be undiscovered, and I walked in anyway, because walking away from true things has never been something I was built for, and it was too late to start. What I found inside was worse than I expected and more complicated than I expected and ultimately more human than I expected. And those three things were all true at the same time and still are. And I am 71 years old and still learning that the capacity to hold contradictory true things simultaneously is not a sign of confusion, but of a kind of hard-won wisdom that you cannot acquire any other way than by living long enough to need it. The Stella's jays come to the feeder every morning. Miriam tends the garden with the same patient precision she brings to everything she loves. The coffee is slightly stronger than the instructions recommend, because that is the way it should be. And somewhere in all of it, underneath the loss and the betrayal and the complicated accounting of love and failure, the foundation is still solid, because I poured it myself over 43 years, and I know every load-bearing wall, and I know which cracks can be repaired, and I know how to tell the difference. That is enough. For now, that is enough. If this story reached something in you, if you have ever had to hold two true things about someone you love at the same time and found it almost impossible, I want to hear from you in the comments below. Subscribe so you are here for the next story. And if you believe that the truth, even when it breaks something, is always better than the comfortable version of a lie, hit that like button. It means more than you know.